They say after a while, you get used to the job. The long hours, the stress, the blood. You learn to shut it out, compartmentalize. At least that's what they tell you when you are training to be a first responder paramedic. But some calls stick with you, no matter how many times you try to convince yourself they were just another run. This one happened about 6 years ago. I was working the night shift, paired up with my usual partner, Jake. We'd both been paramedics for over a decade at that point, so we'd seen our fair share of tragedies. But nothing like this. It was just past midnight when dispatch radioed in a motor vehicle accident on a highway about 20 miles outside of town. Single vehicle rollover, one confirmed occupant, unconscious and severely injured. A standard call. We'd responded to dozens just like it. I remember glancing out the window as we drove. Fog had started rolling in heavy, clinging to the road in thick patches. It made visibility a nightmare, but we knew the stretch of highway well. A long, dark road surrounded by thick trees, not much traffic at that hour. As we approached the scene, we saw the flashing lights of a sheriff's cruiser parked on the shoulder. A man was slumped in the driver's seat, looked like the driver, banged up and completely unconscious. The deputy was already checking his vitals, radioing in for backup. And then, I noticed a strange figure through the fog. She was standing just off the road, near the edge of the tree line. A woman, maybe late 20s, early 30s, wearing a white dress. It stood out stark against the darkness, almost glowing in the mist. She wasn't moving, just watching us. I nudged Jake. "Hey, you see her?" Jake was too focused looking ahead at the crash and didn't respond immediately. By the time I turned back, the ambulance had already passed the woman. "What?" he said, finally registering my question. I didn't respond. We had arrived at the crash site and it was violent. The car had flipped multiple times before landing on its side, crumpled like an aluminum can. Glass littered the pavement, catching the red and blue flashes of the sheriff's cruiser. The front end was barely recognizable. Twisted metal, the hood peeled back like a grotesque smile. The smell of burnt rubber and leaking gasoline thickened the air, mixing with the distant scent of pine. In the stillness of the night, the faint ticking of the engine cooling was the only sound, besides the steady hum of our rig's engine. We stepped out of the rig, grabbed our trauma bag, and headed toward the injured driver first. He was in bad shape, unconscious, bleeding but still alive. We were getting ready to stabilize him when I heard the woman's voice. She whispered from a distance, her voice barely above a breath, yet somehow I heard her clear as day. "You need to look over there." The unnatural clarity of it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned. She was pointing toward the ditch on the opposite side of the road. Now I've learned to trust my gut in this line of work. If someone on the scene tells you to check somewhere, you do it. I looked over to Jake, doing all he can to stop the driver's bleeding, still oblivious to the presence of the woman. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking towards the direction she had pointed. The fog was thick and the grass was slick with moisture as I stepped down into the ditch. At first, I didn't see anything, but then my light caught something. A shape, a body, a young woman, maybe early 20s, lying motionless in the tall grass. My pulse jumped. If we hadn't been told to check, we might have never seen her. I dropped to my knees beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck, and I feel a pulse. Weak, but there. "She's alive!" I shouted back up to Jake, already reaching for my radio. "We need another unit here now." Jake came running and started prepping an airway kit, checking her breathing. She was severely injured, but hanging on. We carefully lifted her onto a gurney and strapped her in for transport. As we carried her up the ditch, she stirred, just barely. Her eyes fluttered open, and she struggled weakly against the harness, like she was trying to point at something. Her arms were pinned inside the straps, but her gaze was locked on a spot just past my shoulder. Instinctively, I turned my head, following her line of sight. For just a second, through the mist, I saw her. The woman in white, standing at the tree line, watching, and then she was gone. Both of them survived. We got them to the hospital just in time, and over the next few days, they stabilized. I didn't think much about what had happened that night, at least not until I got a phone call. I was off duty, sitting at home, when my cell rang. Unknown number. I answered. It was an unknown woman. Her voice was hesitant at first. Is this? She paused. Is this David? David O'Connor. There was a brief silence, just the sound of her breathing on the line, uneven, like she wasn't sure what to say next. I was in an accident on Beartooth Highway. Do you remember me? She finally asked. I did. Yes, I said. She exhaled shakily. Thank you for saving my life. Then silence again, longer this time, like she didn't know what to say next. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Did you see her too? My stomach tightened. I didn't need to ask who she meant. She let out a shaky breath. It was Emily, she said, my sister. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. She died on that road, she continued, years ago in a crash, just like ours. The line went quiet for a moment. Then she asked again, softer this time. You saw her too, didn't you? I didn't answer. I just sat there, phone pressed to my ear, heart hammering in my chest. Because I had. To this day, I don't know what we saw. I don't know who or what helped us find her that night. But I do know one thing. Somewhere out there, a woman in white is still watching that road, and she's making sure no one else gets left behind.